Hello, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacts to the BC port workers going back on strike as union workers have rejected a tentative deal. The government of Alberta announced how Indigenous partnerships will support addiction recovery on the Blood Tribe. And we hear from a man who is biking across Canada, raising awareness for those who are battling schizophrenia.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. BC port employers say the Longshore Workers Union has given a 72-hour notice of renewed strike action beginning Saturday morning at 9 a.m. On Tuesday, Federal Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan says the Canada Industrial Relations Board has ruled a strike by BC port workers is illegal since notice was not originally filed. Members are heading back to their picket lines after rejecting the tentative mediated 4-year deal. O'Regan says he respects the collective bargaining process, but that workers and employers across Canada cannot face a further delay in getting cargo moving through BC ports. Billions of dollars has already been lost. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in Niagara Falls discussing the port workers' strike in British Columbia. Poilievre says the strike falls directly on the shoulders of O'Regan and the Prime Minister.
This strike is an example of Justin Trudeau's total incompetence. First of all, he caused the strike by raising the cost of living. We see labor strife right across Canada now because workers are desperately fighting for the raises they need to pay the exorbitant grocery and housing bills that Trudeau has foisted on their backs. Second, his mediator and his minister have failed to get the two parties to the table and secure a deal. Third, his Labour minister pumped his fist in the air and declared victory, saying the strike was over and that he should deserve a big pat on the back. Well, we learn now he was wrong. The strike was not over. Justin Trudeau must do his job and end this strike immediately because of the massive cost to workers, consumers, and businesses. And we're calling on him to deliver a plan to end this strike within the next 24 hours.
Meanwhile, the writers and actors strikes continue in Hollywood. They're seeking better wages and protections from artificial intelligence. Stars from the Screen Actors Guild and talent backed by the Writers Guild of America joined forces in solidarity during the walkout. Now, the owner of the Movie Mill here in Lethbridge, Lynn Binning, says the theatre will not be impacted short-term, but if the strike looms long-term, it could pose problems.
It's the first-run theaters that are going to be hit hardest because you're not going to see any press junkets. You're not going to see any red carpet premieres because the actors are forbidden from promoting current films, and all production has stopped. Now, not a bad thing in that there's a lot of product already ready to come down, but Hollywood might say we need to pump our brakes a little bit and slow our rollout if this is going to be a long strike.
This is the first time since 1960 that the two unions have united for a strike mandate. Back then, Ronald Reagan helped lead the charge as president of the Screen Actors Guild. The Alberta government, along with members of the Blood Tribe, held a very special groundbreaking ceremony on Wednesday. It was to mark the beginning of what will soon be a new 75-bed recovery community for those facing addictions. The facility, to be located just outside of Cardston, is one of 11 treatment centres across the province that will be available to all Albertans. Angela Stewart has that story.
Those who battle with addictions will soon have a chance at a fresh start. Wednesday officially kicked off the construction for a new Indigenous-led recovery community on Blood Tribe territory.
The connection that the Blood Tribe members have with the land is sacred, and we plan to honor this connection through a new facility, from the design of the building to the treatment and the healing that takes place inside of it.
A $30 million investment from the province in partnership with the Blood Tribe will see a 75-bed recovery site be built on this land just outside of Cardston, making it the first Indigenous-led recovery site. The Blood Tribe Recovery Community is one of 4 facilities to be built on First Nation communities, which will operate under a holistic approach.
That one person, through addiction, we need to take care of the whole self, more emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually. So we will incorporate some of our own teachings, our own healing methods, and we will integrate with the Western model.
Other communities with recovery sites on the way include Enoch Cree, Tsuut'ina, and Siksika Nations. Up to 300 people every year will have access to the facility and will be available for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Some of these people need to learn how to live again. They need to learn how to make a bed, to have a cup of coffee, as an example. And that's what they're going to be provided. So that journey may take as long as it's going to take. And some people may be there for a year. Some people may be there for a year and a half. But the point is that when they exit that system, they're going to be in a better place from which they started.
The Alberta government anticipates the site to be fully operational by 2024, with construction beginning late this fall. For Bridge City News, I'm Angela Stewart.
Premier Daniel Smith dished out a wide variety of mandate letters to her ministers. One that was given to Health Minister Adriana LaGrange is calling for her to address EMS response times and getting more obstetricians to both Lethbridge and Fort Macleod. Our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, says Albertans will also get a health spending account.
Basically, every Albertan would get a $300 health spending account, similar to what a person might have through their work health insurance. It would just be, funded by the government. So that's sort of the big line item, I guess we could say, in the health minister's mandate letter. But there's a few other things, as you mentioned, getting more obstetricians, focusing on rural medicine. And the other interesting thing that came out of this was the exploration of decentralizing Alberta health services, which, of course, was just centralized, 15 years ago or so.
Tyler Dawson will also have details of how the City of Calgary is considering bidding on the 2030 Commonwealth Games. That's coming up in the second half of our broadcast. Well, it was sunny and hot again today across much of southwestern Alberta. Jeanette Rocher is in now with a quick peek at the forecast. Jeanette, pull up the sunscreen and put on your hat, since the hot temperature should remain with us for the rest of the week and possibly into the weekend.
Yeah, and to be honest, Hal, today was actually expected to be the coolest day of the week at 27, if you can call it cool. But the rest of the week, we are looking at highs of 31s and 33s. So it is starting. It's going to get hot, 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 which I love. Many people hate it, but even our overnight lows are going to be remaining in the teens. Tonight's overnight low, 12 degrees. After this, up in the teens for overnight. Yeah, it's starting. I'll be back later in the show to give you that full 7-day forecast, as well as the national forecast.
Love that summer weather. Thanks so much, Jeanette. The government of Alberta says there are still 121 active wildfires burning here in the province, most in the northern and central regions. Alberta Wildfire says 20 are currently burning out of control and 42 are being held. So far this fire season, our province has experienced a total of 868 wildfires. Officials say around 70% of the wildfires were started by lightning, 12% were suspicious and are currently under investigation, while 18% were human-caused. Meanwhile, in British Columbia, 75 more soldiers are being deployed to help firefighters battle the nearly 400 active wildfires burning in that province. Officials say a number of those military members are headed to Burns Lake and will join the 75 others who were sent to Vanderhoof yesterday as part of federal assistance for the province's wildfire fight. BC has already broken a record for the total area burned in a year, and officials say the season has yet to hit its peak. Health officials say more than 1,200 people in British Columbia have died after overdosing on toxic, unregulated drugs in the first half of this year. The province's chief coroner, Lisa Lapointe, says 184 people died last month alone. She says illicit fentanyl is the main culprit driving the crisis in a number of cities and towns across British Columbia. BC Premier David Eby held a news conference in Campbell River discussing a new healthcare initiative for the province. Eby says a long-term care home will be built in the city featuring more than 150 beds. He says this will help free up hospital beds in the region.
Today's announcement is critically important to recognizing the dignity of every single person that needs care, and also to take pressure off of our primary healthcare system, our urgent care system. Having people in a hospital bed waiting for a long-term space to open means that that hospital bed isn't available for someone that needs urgent care. And so building these beds recognizes the dignity and the unique care needs of people who need long-term care, as well as it takes pressure off our hospitals as well. So that's why today I'm so glad to be here to announce that here in Campbell River, we will be building 153 long-term care beds in a 3-story facility that ensures that people will get high-quality care that supports them, that supports their family, that in fact supports the entire community.
Federal Families Minister Karina Gould spoke at a UN meeting in New York on Wednesday on sustainable development. Gould discussed Canada's progress on implementing the agenda by the year 2030. It is a plan of action to eradicate global poverty and to address climate change. Gould says Canada's relationship with our Indigenous peoples is also vital moving forward.
Reconciliation is a priority for the Government of Canada, and it's a cross-cutting theme across all SDGs. And we are committed to working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to advance the SDGs. I am proud to be leading the country's efforts in reducing poverty and achieving high-quality, affordable early learning education. On SDG 1, No Poverty, we've made significant progress. Through programs like the Canada Child Benefit, Old Age Security Pension, the Guaranteed Income Supplement for Low-Income Seniors, and the Canada Pension Plan, we've exceeded our interim target of a 20% reduction in poverty rates. In 2021, there were close to 2.3 million fewer Canadians living in poverty compared to 2015, including 650,000 children and 11,000 seniors.
A mudslide in the central part of Colombia killed at least 14 people on Tuesday and blocked a major highway that connects Bogota to the country's eastern plains. Officials say the avalanche of mud and debris took out several homes about an hour's drive southeast of Bogota.
Terrible, se fue la luz y venía el aire. Cuando yo sentí el aire dije, corramos por favor todos y nos logramos salvar mi familia y otros amigos de la parte baja, pero la parte hacia arriba todos están desaparecidos.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, government officials there say a Russian airstrike has hit the port city of Odessa. They say the nighttime raids destroyed critical infrastructure and injured several people, including a 9-year-old boy. Odessa was targeted for 2 straight nights once Russia suspended an agreement allowing Ukraine to resume with grain shipments. The attack damaged both grain and oil terminals, taking out storage tanks and loading equipment. A Canadian man is hoping to become the first person with schizophrenia to bike across this beautiful country. Matthew Dixon left Vancouver on June 4th and started pedaling his way across Canada with a goal to arrive in Newfoundland by late August or early September. He's biking around 100 kilometers a day as he raises awareness and funds for those battling the mental illness. Video journalist Micah Quinn caught up with Dixon to discuss his journey.
It's difficult to tell people you have schizophrenia. It took me 30 years before I could even utter the word in public so that random strangers around me might even hear me. That was this March. It took me 30 years to be able to do that. I would always whisper the word.
When Matthew Dixon was just 22 years old, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Fast forward nearly 3 decades later, and Dixon told us recovery is possible.
I noticed an improvement in my health every single week for like almost 30 years. And people may hear that and say, well, I've got schizophrenia and I don't know if I could last 30 years. The pain can, if you get treatment, the pain can diminish. The pain is very bad in the beginning, but with treatment, it can come down to a more manageable level, which allows you to carry on for much longer than you ever thought.
The Schizophrenia Society of Alberta says 1 in 100 people in our province are currently living with the mental illness. Staff with the nonprofit explained to us that schizophrenia is a mental health disorder that can include bouts of psychosis.
One of the main symptoms of psychosis is hallucinations and just sort of a disconnect with reality. So that people with schizophrenia may see, taste, feel, hear, see things that that the rest of us don't see, and it's they only exist in their mind. But as you can imagine, with all of those senses being involved, it's really tough for them to tell what is real and what is not.
Dixon says he's been working hard to break down the stigma surrounding mental illness.
We're not out to hurt anybody. That's the last thing we want to do. And I'm trying to dispel myths like that.
For more information on Dixon's bike ride across Canada, you can visit his Facebook page. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Way to go, Matthew, biking all the way across Canada. Wow. Canadian women look pretty confident and relaxed as they train ahead of their opening match against Nigeria at the FIFA Women's World Cup in Melbourne, Australia. Olympic champion Canada is ranked 7th in the world, while Nigeria is ranked number 40. A player with Team Canada says they're not taking Nigeria lightly, however.
I think this team does an excellent job of staying present in the moment, and to be honest, I don't think that we feel the pressure of gold. We've always underperformed at the World Cup, so I think we're just coming in here. We know what we're capable of. We know what our goals are. We're very clear on that, but we need to get the job done day one to set ourselves up for success. And so we're very focused on the Nigeria game and then making sure we do the right things. Obviously, it's going to be a fight. They're a very physical team. They're very good as well, technically, individually. But I think that we, as a team, we can come out with a win. Defensively, our MO is solid, no goals against, making sure that we shut everything down going forward. We have the players for that, and then going forward, we just need to be clinical, and then the game will take care of itself.
Hopefully they will come out with a big win. Go Team Canada. Well, it was on this day that baseball legend Pete Rose received some jail time. Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit and the Moscow Olympics began. This is Today in History for July the 19th.
July 19th, 1848. A women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, launches the movement to give American women the right to vote. That campaign succeeds when the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution takes effect more than 70 years later. 1993, President Bill Clinton announces the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy on gays serving in the military.
It certainly will not please everyone, perhaps not anyone, and clearly not those who hold the most adamant opinions on either side of this issue.
The compromise forbids the military from asking service members about their sexual orientation, and it requires a discharge for service members who are openly gay or engage in homosexual activity. 1969, Apollo 11 and its 3 astronaut crew start orbiting the moon ahead of man's first landing on the lunar surface. 1990, baseball's all-time hits leader Pete Rose gets 5 months in federal prison and a $50,000 fine for filing false tax returns. That happens after Rose is banned for life from baseball amid claims he bet on the game, something he admits years later. And 1980. The Summer Olympics start in Moscow, minus the United States and dozens of other countries. Those countries decide to boycott the Games over the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Today in History, July 19th. Carlotta Bradley, The Associated Press.
Well, it was sunny and hot again today here in Lethbridge, and that sunshine shall remain for the rest of the week. A full look at the weather pictures coming up. So I was chatting with my neighbors recently, and they're putting in a hot tub. You know, with the weather we've been experiencing lately in Lethbridge, a cool tub may work out a little bit better right now. Jeanette Rocher is now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, it'll be good to keep cool this week as we may be seeing 30+ degree temperatures for the week and possibly into the weekend.
Yeah, I, for one, love a good hot tub, Hal, so I'm with your neighbors on that one. But yes, hot conditions, looking at 31s and 33s across the board. I'm not seeing a lot of wind in the forecast either, and all clear skies as well. So it's going to be very warm, even in the evenings. Overnight, we're looking at double digits and teen temperatures, 14s and 13s there. So it's going to be a very warm week. So like you said before, get your sunscreen, get your hat, get it ready, go to the beach, do what you can to stay cool. According to the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 26, average low 11 degrees, 39 was our high temperature. Back in 1960 and in 1996, we saw a low of 5 degrees, 5:45. That's when the sun rose this morning. Our sun set this evening right at 9:30 on the nose. We're looking at 15 hours and 45 minutes of daylight. Okay, so sunny on the west coast. Victoria looking at a high of 25, more like 20 in the Juan de Fuca Strait. And speaking speaking of that Juan de Fuca Strait, it's going to be windy there as well, up to 60k winds. High of 26 in Vancouver. Further inland you go, we're looking at 30 degrees and a humidex of 33. So going to be hot, humid conditions there. 26 for a high in Edmonton with mainly sunny skies in the morning, looking at a mix of sun and cloud by the afternoon, and afternoon winds up to 20k. Same thing for Calgary, starting out sunny, mix of sun and cloud as the afternoon rolls on, and 20k wind, high of 27 there. As we get to the rest of the prairies in Saskatoon and Regina, both also seeing sunshine in the morning with a mix of sun and cloud in the afternoon, and hazy conditions, high of 24 Saskatoon, 26 for a high in Regina, and Winnipeg's also looking at a high of 26 with mainly clear skies, so lots of sunshine there for our friends in Winnipeg. As we look to the central part of the country, Toronto, high of 27, looking at a 40% a chance of afternoon showers with a risk of a thunderstorm there. Mix of sun and cloud in Ottawa with high of 28 degrees. Same thing for Montreal with clear skies, though high of 28 degrees. Also humid conditions as well. As we get to the East Coast, Fredericton looking at a little bit of rain there, 27 for a high, 26 for a high in Halifax with fog retreating into the coast in the morning. Also some showers expected in Charlottetown, fog dissipating in the morning, 24 for a high there, 28 in St. John's, Newfoundland, looking at some onshore winds in the morning. As we get into those onshore winds, looking at 24 for a high only, but I will mention that there has been a heat warning in effect there as those hot, humid conditions do persist into tonight and tomorrow. Humidex there up to 37, so it is going to be very humid there up in Newfoundland. There you have it. That is your forecast.
Stats Canada's inflation data for June shows consumers paid 14.7% less for cellular services compared to a year ago. That comes after an 8.2% decline in May. Industry analysts are hopeful that Canada's phone and internet prices will continue to decline, but say there's a long way to go when it comes to telecom affordability here in the country. StatCan attributes phone bill relief to both lower prices for cellular data plans and promotional pricing. BC port employers say the Longshore Workers Union has given 72-hour notice of renewed strike action starting Saturday morning. The BC Maritime Employers Association says resuming strike action that halted cargo for almost 2 weeks is unnecessary and reckless. Members of the union had returned to the picket lines originally late Tuesday after members rejected the tentative mediated deal. Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan declared the renewed strike action illegal, citing the Canada Industrial Relations Board ruling that the union had not given the proper 72-hour notice. But the employers say now that the union has officially given its notice, it means the strike will resume around 9 a.m. on Saturday. Cody Battershill is the founder of Canada Action, a group which supports and promotes Canada's energy sector. There's been a lot of talk coming out of Ottawa that the Trudeau government wants to eventually phase out our oil and gas sectors. Battershill explains what would happen if the federal government decided to no longer refine our oil and gas.
It would honestly be oil and gas imported from other countries. There's currently no substitute. So yeah, let's build wind and solar. Let's also maybe look at hydro and nuclear power. But we also are going to need oil and natural gas for a long time. There's no technology today to replace oil and natural gas in the world. And fossil fuels today are about 80% of global energy. It was about 85% 20 years ago. And it was about 90% 20 years before that. It goes to show you how long these things take. And in 20 years from now, it'll be maybe 75%.
Make sure you catch the full interview with Cody Battershill from Canada Action and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up later in our broadcast. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 114 points on the day to finish at 20,491. The Dow was up 109 points to 35,061. The S&P 500 was up 10 on the day to 4565, and the Nasdaq was up 4 points to 14,358. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 40 cents to 75.35 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 3 cents to 2.60 US. Gold was up 15 cents to 1976.79 US an ounce, and silver was up 5 cents to 25.11 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.43 per bushel, barley's at $9.47, canola's at $19.53, and corn is at $10.19 per bushel. For the livestock, these are all August contracts. Live cattle were up 5 cents to $181.33. Feeder cattle were down $1.20 to $246.80, and lean hogs were up $1.65 to 97.93. The Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours at 75.96 US. Recapping one of our top stories, BC Premier David Eby is calling for a quick resolution after the union representing thousands of BC port workers says they're going back on strike this weekend. The Longshore Workers Union rejected a 4-year tentative deal and walked. The BC Maritime Employers Association says the union was presented with a fair deal and that renewing the strike means the union is doubling down on holding the Canadian economy hostage. Union members say they've now officially given 72-hour strike notice and that the walkout will resume Saturday morning at 9 a.m. There's an insurance provider which pulled out of the province, leaving around 16,000 Albertans without auto insurance. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details for us shortly. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. The Lethbridge International Air Show returns July 29th and 30th at the Lethbridge Airport. Gates open at 9 a.m. This family-friendly event features crowd-pleasing aerial performances, exciting displays of planes, jets, and helicopters, plus a food truck fair, monster truck rides, a kids' playland market, and trade show. So much to see and do at the Lethbridge International Air Show, July 29th and 30th. Do you have a heart to serve our community? The Lethbridge Soup Kitchen is looking for volunteers to help prepare, serve, and clean up after meals that are given every day. The Lethbridge Soup Kitchen's mission is to help alleviate the struggle of poverty for individuals and families who are poor, have very limited income, or just in need of a hot meal. They also desire to increase public awareness of the needs of the poor and homeless in Lethbridge. For information and to volunteer, visit lethbridgesoupkitchen.ca. And that's today's Bridge City News community calendar.
Earlier this year, the Smith government here in Alberta froze auto insurance rates for the rest of 2023. This was done in order to give the province a little more time to work with the industry and to help keep premiums a little lower. Now, one insurance company has pulled out of Alberta altogether, leaving about 16,000 Albertans stranded on the side of the road without auto insurance. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, at this point, do we know which company actually pulled out?
We don't, which is very strange because you'd think that people would need to know that. Now, I think it's probably reasonably safe to assume that that company is contacting the people who are, auto insurance customers with them. But the government hasn't said, they cite confidentiality rules saying they're not going to tell us which insurance company this is. But it does sort of speak to this wider issue of insurance rates. Because the NDP capped auto insurance, years ago, and then the UCP dropped the cap, and now it's back as part of the Smith government sort of overall affordability measures scheme. So the question going forward a little bit is, are other companies going to end up leaving? Is there going to be some sort of disruption in the insurance industry? Is the cap simply going to lift at the end of the year? So it's a little bit of an odd time for auto insurance, it seems, and I don't know about you, but this is not something that I think about more than once a year when my renewal comes up and I look at the price and put in an outraged phone call. But it is sort of odd. And this mystery of which insurance company this is still out there.
My son just moved back to Alberta from Ontario, moved in with us. I had to put him on our insurance, and my insurance doubled just putting my son on. I'm like, what? Per month it just doubled. So a bit of a shock to us as well here. Now, Tyler, Premier Danielle Smith has been issuing some mandate letters to her ministers. The most recent one was to Health Minister Adriana LaGrange. Now, the Premier has been tasking her with developing the health spending account proposal. It also lists other areas to focus on, such as EMS response times and getting more obstetricians here in Lethbridge and Fort Macleod. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so Danielle Smith has been releasing her mandate letters sort of a couple at a time over the last week or two here. So we've seen a handful of them, but as you say, the most recent one is the health one. And the health one, particularly on the health spending account, is sort of interesting because last week, I believe it was, the Service Alberta Minister, Nate Glubish, I think, got his mandate letter, and it was sort of wishy-washy, a little bit vague on the health spending account thing. It was sort of look into the technology to see if this would be a viable proposal sort of thing. So that sort of seemed like it was a little bit up in the air, but now we have the health minister's mandate letter that seems to suggest this proposal's back on, which is, of course, that basically every Albertan would get a $300 health spending account, similar to what a person might have through their work health insurance. It would just be, funded by the government. So that's sort of the big line item, I guess we could say, in the health minister's mandate letter. But there's a few other things, as you mentioned, getting more obstetricians, focusing on rural medicine. And the other interesting thing that came out of this was the exploration of decentralizing Alberta health services, which of course was just centralized, 15 years ago or so. We'll have to see what happens there. Of course, it was a huge controversy the last time it happened. I can't imagine it's going to be any less controversial this time around.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of talk among the municipalities was also decentralizing the EMS dispatch services, right? So ambulance would get to certain locations a lot quicker as well. I know Lethbridge was on board and a lot of other municipalities as well, Red Deer too. So now, Tyler, the mandate letter to Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz caused a little bit of controversy. Can you explain why?
Well, basically the sense from critics, not that critics ever have anything positive to say, is that there was not all that much environment in the Environment Minister's mandate letter. There's a fair bit of stuff in there about the oil and gas sector in terms of promoting it as the most environmentally responsible petroleum on the planet. There are items about oil sands tailings ponds, cleanup, that sort of thing that's sort of been, these have been issues for a long time and are, regular things that the Environment Minister is going to be looking at. But the sort of big item that didn't seem to be in there that critics were concerned about was anything about coal mining on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. That's been a big issue down your way when there was the whole, the 1976 coal policy was suddenly dropped, and then the small town mayors got upset about it, and the UCP said, this is just city slickers being mad about it, but actually it wasn't at all. And so I think the policy is back on. But anyways, the whole coal mining thing did not seem to make an appearance, which sort of raised a few eyebrows among people who pay attention to this sort of stuff. So it'll be a bit interesting. The sense from some of these critics was that, the environment's taking a little bit of a back seat to other priorities here. But whether that's fair or not, I think it is fair to say that there is a little bit more focus on the industry side of the environment, for example, than would be the case if, say, Rachel Notley had won the last election.
Now, Tyler, Environment Minister Schultz was scheduled to meet with Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault this week to discuss emissions targets. As you know, the UCP disagrees with the Liberals on a number of policies, including a net zero electricity grid.
Yeah, so this would basically mean that there needs to, a net zero electricity grid, net zero emissions from the electricity grid, which is a bit of a problem for Alberta because although we've largely eliminated, dirty fuel such as coal, the bulk of the electricity grid is natural gas at this point. So it's sort of a challenging target for the province to hit, and that's been quite controversial. Now, the other thing that was expected to come up in this meeting is the net zero emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is supposed to be in by 2030, I think. Now, part of the reason why this is controversial is there was a report issued earlier this week that basically concluded that in order to hit that target of net zero, the oil and gas sector would need to reduce production by about 1.3 million barrels per day, which is a pretty significant cut to the oil sector's output. So, there's a fair bit of distance, I think it's fair to say, between what the Alberta government wants and what the federal Liberal government wants on some of this emissions stuff. There's a little bit less distance. There have been a number of meetings recently. Jonathan Wilkinson was in the province a couple weeks back. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with Danielle Smith last week, I think it would have been. And so there's the net zero electricity grid, there's the oil and gas emissions, and then the third thing is the sort of Sustainable Jobs Act, which is the rebranded Just Transition Plan, which has also been quite controversial. Those are sort of the three big energy-related sticking points between the governments. And there does seem to be some sort of willingness to at least discuss working together on the Sustainable Jobs Act, for example, to create some sort of workers working group to discuss it, that sort of thing. I have a hard time imagining that Stephen Guilbeault is going to bend all that much on emissions targets, but certainly, everyone's come out of these meetings speaking fairly well of each other, which is, that's how these things happen. But certainly we're seeing a tamping down of some of the fireworks maybe that we've seen over the last few years.
Let's discuss the mandate letter to Finance Minister Nate Horner for just a moment. It suggested a referendum on whether Alberta should ditch the CPP and create its own pension plan. Tyler, according to some recent polls, leaving the Canada Pension Plan has not been very popular.
No, it's not, which it makes it a little bit confusing why it's something the government is looking at. I believe it is part of the United Conservative Party's sort of grassroots policy development stuff. At the convention, they discuss various things, and it ends up being party policy, and it may or may not become government policy at that point. But it does seem to be the sort of thing that is not super popular, no matter how you slice it. This is an old idea. This goes back to sort of the firewall letter from 2001. This was all about, wresting a little bit more control of Alberta's destiny from Ottawa. But it hasn't been popular. And the idea, of course, is that if Alberta takes its money out of the CPP, it will be able to manage it itself. Perhaps there'll be better returns, won't be paying out to other parts of the country, things like that. But the NDP's had quite a powerful campaign against it, basically suggesting that this is going to make people's pension available as a political or financial plaything for the government of the day. So I think it's been a fairly effective campaign against it. But anyways, there is, this talk is going to keep going, and there may be a referendum on it, and we'll see what happens then. Of course, then the question becomes what happens next? How long does it take to make something like this happen? But it is very interesting that it's still sort of a thing that the government is considering.
Well, we just had the greatest outdoor show on earth take place in Calgary, and now the Stampede City is considering launching a bid to land the 2030 Commonwealth Games. Now, this has led to an interesting proposal. Do tell.
Yeah, so when Calgary was going through its discussion about the Olympics a couple years ago, everyone was sort of paying attention. This was a province-wide sort of issue, even though it was one city considering it, because of course the province was involved, and that means that there was the potential for provincial money to be involved. Now, Joseph Scow, who's the new sports and tourism minister, has said that there might be a province-wide referendum on any future international games hosting situations. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what that means is that if Calgary goes ahead with this bid, or considers an Olympics bid in the future, everyone in Alberta might get to vote on whether or not this sort of thing should go ahead, because of course it's going to be the tax dollars not just of Calgarians, but people in Fort McMurray and Lethbridge and wherever else. So we'll see if that comes ahead. Again, we'll also see if that proposal wins when it's put in front of provincial voters, if that's what the government chooses to do.
Tyler, Casey Medu, the former justice minister who lost his seat in the provincial election, is now facing disciplinary action from the Law Society over potentially unprofessional actions. Does this potentially have something to do with a ticket he received in Edmonton?
It does, yeah. So a couple of years ago, Medu was pulled over in a school zone, I believe for distracted driving, and got a $300 ticket. What happened next was that he put in a phone call to the chief of police and had basically, raised concerns about the ticket, essentially asking whether or not he'd been racially profiled when he was pulled over. And so what happened after that, Jason Kenney was still premier at the time, and a retired judge looked into it and basically found that it was an inappropriate phone call for Medu to have made. And so it's from that the Law Society is now saying, okay, well, this thing happened. Does this bring the justice system and the law profession into disrepute? So it hasn't gotten that far down the road of disciplinary action just yet. It's not as far, for example, as Tyler Shandro, who's also facing discipline, and he's had a couple of hearings into his conduct. So also kind of interesting, we have two former justice ministers who are currently dealing with the Law Society of Alberta for their conduct when they were in government.
Let's talk a bit about Premier Danielle Smith's tenure so far. It appears as though she's making some friends and even some allies when it comes to a wide range of areas, including bail reform?
So far, this seems like the big story of the first, couple months of Danielle Smith's time as premier, I think. And if you go back the last few years, I mean, Jason Kenney was very loud, very bullish. There was a lot of the talk about fight back strategy, the equalization referendum, all this stuff. There was the carbon tax lawsuit. It was just one thing after another fighting with Ottawa. And at the end of the day, not that much got done. Nothing happened with equalization, for example. The carbon tax lawsuit lost at the Supreme Court. Bill C-48 and Bill C-69 are still law. So that strategy ended up being not all that effective. And so one of the ironies here is that Danielle Smith, one of the reasons Kenney was kicked out and Smith came in is because UCP voters, sort of party faithful, felt that Kenney had not actually been aggressive enough in fighting back against Ottawa. Enter Danielle Smith, who has been fairly aggressive in some of her public statements, but has actually been very sort of conciliatory when it comes to finding allies in other parts of the country. And, there's no way to say at this point whether or not she's going to have success on these fronts. But if you look at her meetings with other premiers in the last couple of weeks, you had the meeting of the Western and Northern premiers. You had some statements coming from the Atlantic Canadian premiers on the clean fuel standard. You have an pretty close agreement between Danielle Smith and NDP Premier David Eby in BC on getting emissions credits for liquid natural gas exported to Asia. So this is a long, rambly way of me saying that you have several issues right now that Danielle Smith has talked about, and you have other premiers who are in agreement. And as you mentioned, bail reform is another one. A number of premiers and municipal politicians as well calling on the Liberals to do something about bail. She seems to have allies, and this is very different from the Kenney years when it was just sort of Jason Kenney, maybe Scott Moe, maybe Brian Pallister when he was Premier of Manitoba was getting in on some of this. The carbon tax was a slightly bigger alliance. But Danielle Smith does seem to be making friends among the other premiers, and that really raises the question of just how many premiers Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is willing to fight with over whichever policy of the day is up for discussion.
Be interesting to see the way that plays out. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us once again from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Canada's energy sector continues to supply petrochemicals both here at home and around the world. In fact, there's nothing a consumer in this world purchases that is not thanks to oil and natural gas. As conversations of climate health and divesting of Canadian oil and gas holdings pop up, where are Canada's oil and gas resources and industries headed? Well, joining me from Calgary is Cody Battershill, founder of Canada Action. It's a volunteer-led, actually, grassroots movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of the natural resources sectors of our nation. Cody, welcome to Bridge City News. Great to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It's always great to be here.
Oh, well, appreciate that for sure. Well, this is such a big topic of conversation. And of course, I have to ask, how important is Canadian oil and gas on a world stage, Cody?
I mean, first and foremost, we all use oil and gas every day to stay alive, not just in transportation and heating, but also in fertilizer, also in all of the products that we use every day in our daily modern lives. So that at a fundamental level, it's all of our basic needs are assisted or facilitated through products and energy that's derived from oil and natural gas. On a global stage, we know that global oil and gas demand continues to grow. We know that Canada is a leader in reducing emissions, working with Indigenous communities, supporting human rights, and we need to be a part of the energy security calculation for our allies and trading partners globally so they can buy from Canada instead of buying from countries that aren't always reliable, don't always share our values, they may not be democracies. There's a whole host of other reasons, and it really just solidifies the importance, the significance. And as long as the world is using oil and natural gas, it should absolutely, positively be coming from Canada.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and obviously we hear a lot of negatives, a lot about those negatives of Canada's oil and gas, but you've painted kind of a picture there of why you think the oil and gas industry deserves to be placed in a more positive light.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of negatives that are, not the whole story. There's a lot of people that might be protesting. They might not have all the facts. Maybe they were misled by a group that's trying to shut down Canadian energy production. But those groups aren't talking about oil imports to Canada from countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia in the past decade or decades. They're not talking about oil tankers on the West Coast from Alaska. They're not talking about what would happen if we shut down Canadian oil and gas. And what would happen is a dramatic contraction in our economy, hundreds of thousands of families, millions of Canadians without employment, without livelihoods. And we would be immediately trying to build import facilities to replace locally produced oil and gas so that we did not all descend into chaos and anarchy as a society with no power, with no heat, with no food, with no plastics to keep our hospitals running. And there's so many more layers that we could peel back on the repercussions of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Cody. Now, one of the things that many people do appreciate about Canada Action, your organization, are your infographics. So one thing that caught our eye was about electric cars. So it says that if all the cars were electric by 2040, the world would demand for oil and gas. The world demand for oil and gas would actually be at 2013 levels. So maybe can you give a few more details about the worldwide demand for oil and natural gas?
Yeah, so when we talk about electric cars, it's important to think about how those cars are made. They're made from a lot of mining. They're made from a lot of advanced plastics and composites. The batteries are quite heavy, so the cars have to be as light as possible in every other part of their production, and that's oil and natural gas derived petrochemicals. And so even if the trajectory of electric vehicle growth continues as it's trending, we're still going to see robust oil and oil demand. One study had said that oil demand would be around 90 million barrels a day. Another recent projection from the U.S. Energy and Information Administration said that in 2040, 2050, oil demand will still be about the level it is today. So even if it's not growing, that's still an Olympic-sized swimming pool of oil every 5-10 seconds that the globe is consuming. And yeah, let's support all energy sources and electric vehicles, but let's continue to support Canada's natural economic strengths. And a key part of that is oil and natural gas production that we do responsibly, and I would argue better than almost anywhere else in the world.
Okay. Now, you were recently in a debate involving the BC Teachers Union. So if unions did begin to drop Canadian oil and gas companies from their pension plans, what impact would that have for Canadian companies? Or would the returns for the pension be the victim?
Well, there's a lot of, so over the last many years now, it's been shown through various studies that the returns for those pensioners has actually been reduced at times. So that's a big implication. The other implication is the symbolic action of selling some stock in publicly traded companies that have the highest standards of environment, social, and governance protections. The symbolism does nothing to reduce demand. It does nothing to help the environment. It does nothing to reduce emissions. It's just a symbolic way to take a stand, but that stand is not informed. That stand is actually contradictory to those stated goals of climate action and social progress and supporting equality and environmental protection globally. So those actions hurt Canadians, it hurts pensioners, it can reduce the investment returns, and it does nothing for the environment. All it actually does is help oil and natural gas producers. And again, as I mentioned, it does not reduce demand. It's a symbolic, empty gesture that is actually a negative.
Wow. Okay, so that's just one pension plan. But if you think bigger, how can economies like those of Canada's provinces replace the economic benefits of our oil and gas industry?
Oil and natural gas is our number one export as a country. And when you look at Canada's exports, the vast majority of our top exports are natural resources. Thank a farmer, thank a forestry worker, thank a miner, thank an oil and gas worker, thank everyone who works in our grocery stores and our truck drivers, because all of these people work together to keep us living in our modern world the way that we are accustomed to. Very comfortable. Everything's at your fingertips. Everything's easy. And it wasn't always like that if we look back at history. And so we absolutely have to think about the massive economic benefits. One quick stat, from 2000 till 2032, there was a study that said the oil and natural gas industry would generate $1.1 trillion for our Canadian governments. And that's more than real estate and construction combined. And what does that government revenue pay for? Roads, schools, transit, clean technology initiatives, teachers, police officers, emergency responders. The basic fundamental foundation of our society as Canadians is what those government revenues fund. And so we have to be balanced, and I think as Canadians all work together to support all Canadian energy equally.
Okay, well, Cody, this list might be too long, but what products are made from petrochemicals? Can you maybe describe what our world would look like without oil and gas?
Well, I mean, Vaclav Smil is a great author, Bill Gates' favorite author, and he's a professor in Winnipeg at the university. And he says that the modern world is built on four fundamental materials, and that's cement, steel, ammonia, and plastic. And all of those require fossil fuels. And there's no immediate way today to switch out the fossil fuel components. Let's talk about ammonia and natural gas-based fertilizers. Currently, those fertilizers are feeding about half the world. We don't always think about how that fertilizer is made, but natural gas is a tremendous part of that. In Canada, in Alberta, when it's minus 40, what are we going to do for heat? What are we going to do for the plastics in hospitals? We start life in a hospital, and unfortunately, we often will end our lives in a hospital. Those plastics, those advanced materials are a fundamental part of modern medicine and our expanded lifetimes, life expectancies as humans in Canada and humans around the world. So, you know, when you look around your house, every single thing, everything you eat, everything you do, everything you own, everything you've ever done is made possible by natural resources. It's not always obvious, but oil and natural gas is a core component of everything we have, everything we do. Not just gasoline, not just plastics for the electric vehicle, but everything else I've detailed. It's incredibly important we have these more balanced conversations about this topic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so when we think about all the modern gadgets that we have and even our utilities, what could possibly replace Canadian petrochemicals in our modern needs?
It would honestly be oil and gas imported from other countries. There's currently no substitute. So yeah, let's build wind and solar. Let's also maybe look at hydro and nuclear power. But we also are going to need oil and natural gas for a long time. There's no technology today to replace oil and natural gas in the world. And fossil fuels today are about 80% of global energy. It was about 85% 20 years ago. And it was about 90% 20 years before that. It goes to show you how long these things take. And in 20 years from now, it'll be maybe 75%. 75% of global energy with a growing global population. There's still about 3 billion people today that don't have either reliable electricity or any electricity at all, or clean cooking fuels. That's 3 billion people that would love to live like we live today here. So we got to have that global perspective, do all of the above. But oil and natural gas is going nowhere anytime soon. And anyone who tells you that is ignoring the reality, the physics, the science, and honestly, the positivity and the facts about Canadian oil and natural gas.
Interesting. And of course, there's all that talk of green barrels of energy. And maybe can you compare the difference between oil and gas extraction here in Canada versus other parts of the world?
Well, a big stat that we should all be celebrating is that emissions from Canadian oil and gas production actually peaked about 8 years ago. And since then, production is up 16%, but emissions are down 7%. Now, we are a global leader in monitoring our emissions, in working on land reclamation, in reducing water consumption, in collaborating as an industry to reduce all of those environmental impacts. Now, when you look at the world's top 10 oil exporters, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, Canada, Iraq, Iran, Nigeria, the UAE, Venezuela at one point, Mexico. There's all these other countries that are also we're competing with. When you look at all those countries, the top exporters, Canada is the #1 ranked country for different global indices like environmental sustainability from Yale and like the Women, Peace and Security Index and the Transparency Index through the Corruption Perception Index, which ranks transparency. We're #1 of those countries. You talk about social progress, you talk about human rights, you talk about democracy, you talk about all of these important values. The environment, yes, and emissions, yes, but also how do we treat people? How do we treat all people in our society? And that's also really important. Look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Should we be buying from countries like that are invading countries, other countries, or should we be buying friendshoring? And that's what we've been hearing more and more about. So it is incredibly important that the world gain access to increased supply of Canadian oil and natural gas. We should make all other countries compete with us. Just like we want Team Canada to win the gold in hockey, Team Canadian Resources should be winning the gold in the competition globally to supply the growing global population and growing demand for natural resources.
We only have a couple minutes left here, but when we hear about pollution across the world, can you help put Canada's pollution output into perspective when compared to other nations or regions?
Yeah, and we got to talk. So we can talk about emissions, we can talk about land, we can talk about water. I think when we talk about one quick stat regarding emissions would be that we are actually a global leader in reducing methane and flaring from our oil and gas industry. So there's a study done by the U of C that said if the rest of the world copied our standards, the average emissions from barrel of oil would reduce by 23% oil production, the upstream production emissions. That's about taking 100 million cars off the road. And if we want to talk right now about reducing global impacts, getting as much Canadian liquefied natural gas to Asia and the world will absolutely have the largest immediate impact on reducing global emissions. That's climate action today. Canadian natural gas, more Canadian oil. We rank incredibly well. I mean, Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver over the last many years have been 3 of the world's top most livable places to live, some of the world's cleanest cities. We know that we have an incredibly strong consensus at a national level that we care about the environment. We also care about supporting our families, and we need to care more about having the maximum positive impact on the global trade, global security, and that's Canadian oil and natural gas and wind and solar and. It's all of the above. And people that are saying shut it down are ignoring the reality of how they live, how we live, the impacts, and the massive global positives that Canadian oil and natural gas brings.
All right, Cody, it looks like we are out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your perspective.
It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. My pleasure. Thank you. Cody Battershill is the founder of Canada Action, a volunteer-led movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of the natural resources sector of our nation. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.